In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
Welcome back to the Daily Memphian's Memphis Grizzlies podcast. This is your host, Grizzlies reporter Drew Hill, joined as always by columnist Chris Herrington. We are joining you on Wednesday, June the 11th. There will be a NBA Finals game later tonight. And we are in the thick of the Grizzlies offseason, but not an offseason with no news. We have some news. It's not great news. Zach Edey is having ankle surgery, or did have ankle surgery. It was successful. The team said that they will reevaluate him in 4 months. That means reevaluating him right as the season's about to start. Chris, can you just give me your initial thoughts on the news that came in about the big man?
It's sort of funny when you get the successful surgery like thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess in theory, a surgery could go bad like in the moment, and it's unsuccessful, and that's a bad situation. But that's not typically what happens. And so in reality, we'll know how successful it is in 4 months when they reevaluate him. That's when we'll know, right?
Yes.
It's not good. Clearly, I mean, this is not. I mean, sprained ankles happen all the time. You don't usually get surgery in them, so it's a pretty bad situation when a sprained ankle is leading to a surgery. There's that. There's the fact that he is a 7'4", nearly 300-pound person. And so any lower body injuries for guys that big is, I think, always a red flag. All of that said, I think the ankle thing is probably maybe a little bit less of a concern than some major knee injury or some other, kind of lower body injuries that could happen. He is young. From a short-term standpoint, it's better that this happened in a training session in June than in training camp in October, because now the recovery period will happen almost entirely during a period when there are no games anyway. So imagine this happening in October or whatever, like the Gigi Jackson injury would have been a much worse situation for next season. I think the bigger concern is more the long-term. And if you look at these kind of surgeries, and I've done a little bit of research on this, the two that I found that are the closest to what this seems to be are Sam Merrill and Taj Gibson. I found out there are a couple others that are in the ballpark, but maybe they had additional complications. Like Joe Harris. Joe Harris had one, but his was a second. It was a second surgery on the ankle that this happened. It was after he'd already had a surgery on it that didn't go well. He had this surgery. And I got Chris Mim. This is going way back, but Chris Mim had this. But in addition to this, he had bone issues, right? He was having to relocate a bone in his heel. So that's more significant. And so the idea that and the Grizzlies aren't calling this a ligament reconstruction. They're calling it a stabilization. I don't know whether most of these, when you look them up, they're described as reconstructions. I don't know if there's a real difference there or just a linguistic difference, just a wording difference. But if you look at the surgeries that Taj Gibson and Sam Merrill had, they were surgeries that were called ligament reconstructions, but they were based off of not just you had an injury, you have to have surgery. It was recurring issues that people were trying to fix, right? Apparently with Taj Gibson, when he had this, he'd been playing with ankle problems all season. And then when June came, he had the surgery on it. And Sam Merrill apparently had multiple ankle sprains in the same ankle like Zach Edey had, and they decided to have surgery to help him going forward. And that seems to be the case here. He's had multiple sprains to the same ankle over the last year, and there's apparently a concern that he's lost a lot of stability in the ligaments after the multiple sprains, and that while he could rest and play through it, I guess, he is more likely to keep having issues with it if they don't do the surgery. And so the hope is that the surgery stabilizes it and there's better outcomes going forward. So if you look at the Merrill and the Gibson examples, let's say Merrill's a smaller guard, so there's that. But he came back and he wasn't even an NBA player really when he had it. He was on the Grizzlies roster as the 15th man, barely playing. But he went, but but so that's the kind of injury that could just end your career, right? If you're not your career hasn't even started to begin with, like you're like this undrafted guy or whatever. And he's come all the way through and come back and established himself as a really good NBA player. The Gibson thing is probably more interesting because he's a big man, not as big as Edey, but he's a 6'10" power forward center. He had this same surgery in June of a season, at the end of a season in June, and he was back on the floor for opening night in late October the next year. Played 73 games that next season, and basically played another 10 years in the NBA. And so I think that's a hopeful scenario, but that is sort of the hope that not only does Edey make it back from this and relatively, not too deep into next season, but that this makes him less likely to have these problems going forward. That's the hope.
Yeah, for sure. And you know what? It's interesting. I think there's two ways to look at this. There's what does this mean for Zach Edey and what does this mean for the Grizzlies?
Yeah.
And you start with Zach Edey, and as you mentioned, there's examples. Chris Middleton had double ankle surgery last year.
Right.
And
he's 34. I think that's a component.
Older player.
He's smaller, but older.
Surgery on both ankles happened right away at the end of the season, and he was back on the court in December.
Right.
I wonder when we're going to see Zach Edey on the court. I'm not trying to be the alarmist that's going to give you the most negative outcome and say it's going to be February. But, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if it was December. Would it surprise you if it was December?
Oh, no, because I think the earliest it's going to be is like mid-November.
Right.
Because when you say you reevaluated in 4 months, that doesn't mean you're going to play if the evaluation is good. That means in 4 months, that's the healing process, right? So in 4 months, they're going to look at it. 4 months from now, it's like October 12th or whatever, right? October 10th. That's preseason. If in 4 months they look at it and the healing is gone 100% perfectly, the best possible outcome, all that means is now you're cleared to like start getting ready to play. And it's probably going to be coming off that injury, and it's probably going to be a month before you would take the court even then, right? Or certainly multiple weeks. And so I think the best case scenario is mid-November, and so no, December wouldn't surprise me in that case.
It's going to be a lot of time where he's going to have to spend off of his feet.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of time where he's going to be on crutches. There's going to be definitely, especially with a player like him and his size, a period of ramp up. We laugh at like the ramp up stuff but this is gonna take ramp up, right? Like especially for a player of his size. So like I don't expect that once they say his ankle's fully healed, he's just gonna be ready to get out there. I wonder if when we show up to training camp in late September, early October, he's gonna be on the basketball court doing and what he's going to be doing. Like that might give us a better idea of when it's going to be. But I'm not going to hold my breath that in 4 months he's going to be ready to play basketball. I just don't think that that's very realistic.
Well, I mean, Vince Williams had a really bad ankle injury, and but not one that he had surgery on, right? Just a bad ankle injury, and he was cleared. He was out there on the floor shooting for like more than a month, before he got back in games, and so. Yeah, this is my point. Like, the reevaluation period just means that's when they'll take a look at it and see if it's healed well enough to move forward. And you hope that you pass that hurdle, right? There's a chance you don't pass that. You need more time. And when you come back it'll be reevaluated again in a month or whatever, right? The hope is that you get the all clear and to begin the ramp up. But to your point, the ramp up is going to be a matter of weeks and maybe a month at least,
Let's stick with what this means for Edey for a moment, and we can go a little bit beyond just the timeline here. Obviously, he's going to be losing an offseason in which you would have hoped there was going to be a leap from year 1 to year 2, and this was going to be an important offseason for him. I think the plan was he wanted to do Summer League. That's obviously not going to happen anymore.
Right.
So a lot is going to change. I think that we have a tendency to talk about what a big summer was going to be, but maybe there's also a tendency to overreact a little bit. When you look back at like the history, it depends. Like if this is the type of surgery where he's never going to be the same physically again, which I don't think we we believe that to be the case. But if
Right.
that happens, that's one thing. But there's a history of young players that have had surgeries or problems earlier in their career, and it didn't completely derail everything. I mean, I think back to like Blake Griffin, right? He
Right.
had the knee, and it didn't derail everything. Ben Simmons obviously is a different player now, but when he started his career, had injuries, came back, was a good player. Like I think that this doesn't have to be some sort of massive blow for Zach Edey. It sucks. Don't get me wrong. Like it would have been way better if he was on the court, and able to practice with the guys and able to get into some sort of flow. But I don't know. Am I naive for not worrying about the fact, like thinking that this is going to completely derail Zach Edey's career because he's going to miss the offseason between his rookie and his sophomore year?
Well, no, I mean, I don't think anyone thinks it's going to derail his career if he gets through it physically just fine. The question would be like skill development for next season and the kind of step forward for next season that
The
people.
Grizzlies don't have a ton of time. They don't have a
Right.
ton of time. That's the problem. It's
Well,
a
no,
race against the clock.
well, that's true, but I mean, it's more than 1 year presumably, and I don't think no one's given up on next season because of this. And so my point is that I'm not. I think if he gets through everything fine physically, I'm not that worried about the lack of skill development in one summer. Like, and I'm not. To me, the bigger concern, even short term, would be the impact on the team in terms of style of play and team style. And I just think he seemed to be so key to the way they wanted to play, and they don't have anyone else on the roster who really replicates that. And what does this do to the kind of system Thomas Isolo wanted to install? Does it alter what he actually installs? I mean, if you radically change like what you were going to do with Edey, then are you trying to change back on the fly? I worry on the short term. Again, assuming Edey gets through it fine physically. I worry on the short term. I think the bigger impact on the team is probably the team stuff more than like Zach Edey didn't get to work on his jump shot over the summer.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we should get into the team stuff. But before we go all the way there, because once we jump in on that, there's going to be no going back. But, it's also, this isn't a dynamic player that's cutting and jumping. And, like, I think that's, like, he needs ankle stability 100%. He's
Right.
battling down there in the paint with physical people. I get that. But, you know, I see this as something that Zach's going to be able to overcome just based on his skill set, the time. He's still early. It's still early in his career. It stinks, but I don't think that this is changing how I feel about Zach Edey going into next season. Unless he's just physically not right. As long as that's the big caveat. As long as the surgery is long-term successful and not just successful as it happens, then I think that this losing a summer league should not have as big of an impact on a player that's like him, especially somebody that's mature like him, because he just you know he's to himself, he's quiet, but he's also very methodical, and you can tell that when you talk to him. Is like I just think he's gonna approach this the right way, and he's one of the players that I would trust to like take the rehab really seriously and do everything he needs to do to get back out there and be the same type of player. So it's crappy news, but I remain optimistic about Zach Edey. Then there's the impact on the team. There is, as you mentioned, there's like nobody like him on the roster. Not
Right.
even close, really. And we entered this offseason probably thinking one way about what the Grizzlies should try to do in free agency. And I wonder if this changes that thinking at all. If you feel like they need to try to make an adjustment to bring in a player similar to Zach Edey.
Well, I thought that before the injury, and I think I did that in a mailbag answer at one point. But I was of the opinion that if they want to play a style that heavily utilizes the Zach Edey skill set, he shouldn't be the only player on the team who has that skill set. Like no one else is going to be Zach Edey. But this is one of the reasons I wondered about Jay Huff going into next season. One thing is that they may clear that contract as part of clearing salary for the Jaron thing, although it wouldn't do that much, it'd do a little bit. But the other thing is just from a skill set standpoint and from a utility standpoint, I thought Huff was a better fit in the system that the Grizzlies ran early in the season than he was in sort of the more Isolo screen heavy system. And then you add on the fact that Brandon Clark has major durability concerns. He's apparently expected to be a full go for training camp, but you can't assume you're getting 82 games out of Brandon Clark or getting 20 plus minutes a game out of Brandon Clark. Like that doesn't happen. And so I was of the opinion they needed to add another big who could be in the rotation and could be more of a screener, rebounder, diver kind of player, even before the Edey injury. And so I think that's even more true now, I suspect. The question is, you just want to sign someone more of a minimum salary guy, or are you looking for someone who's going to play a bigger role? I don't think they should, given their limited resources, I don't think they should commit necessarily either way. But I do think they should be open to bringing in someone who would be more of a platoon kind of center, someone you could see starting 30 games this year and being in the rotation every night. And maybe that's the kind of player that takes the full 8.8 million room exception to get, or you have to get via trade. I don't think they should feel like they have to get that kind of player, especially given their limited resources. But I think that is very much down the ballpark of the kind of players they will look at.
We know the kind of players that they needed down the stretch as they struggled last year. They needed, they traded away Marcus Smart because it wasn't working out. Vince Williams didn't live up to expectations relative to the preseason. Jalen Wells got injured. Jalen Wells will be back, next season, but you're betting on a lot of internal growth there if you think he's going to start every game and he's going to be the guy. And even with that, you would need more depth at that position. So how do you weigh the need for wings versus the need for a center or just a center depth because of the Edey news? Is it possible that they can do both, given sort of, as you've discussed on this podcast, some of the limited options that they have this postseason? Well, this offseason, I should say.
You can address everything. The question is whether you can address it in a way that is satisfactory, right? Like guys sign for minimum salaries, and you can sign someone for a minimum without using the exception, right? Like even if the minimum for a vet is $3 million, that's a separate exception for a minimum. Gary Trent signed for the minimum of Milwaukee and averaged 19 points a game in the playoffs for them, right? You can find guys who sign for the minimum and are in rotations in the league. You're not going to sign a guy for a minimum and he becomes a star, but you can find vet signings who play roles for teams, starter roles or bench roles more than likely. Thomas Bryant's basically on a minimum playing in the rotation as the backup center for the Pacers right now in the playoffs. You can find those kind of guys. So the question is more, I think they tried to address all the stuff. The question is where you push the more resources. And my point is that I don't think they're going to determine that on the front end. I don't think they're going to say, okay, if let's say, for example, we're going to spend $8.8 million from our room exception on one player, and we're going to spend a minimum salary on another. I don't think they're going to say from the jump, we're going to spend the 8.8 on a center and the minimum on a wing, or vice versa. I think it's going to depend on what players can you get for those salary slots. I think there will be some flexibility in terms of that. I don't think you're going to forego a better wing to sign a worse center for more money just because you think that's your bigger need. So I think it's complicated. I think there's a lot of stuff there. There's also trade components that could fit into this. I'm sort of struggling to come up with a tight answer for it because I don't think there is one.
I don't think,
but I don't think it's a situation where I think they have multiple needs. I don't know if any of them are so imperative that it's at all costs we have to get this specific kind of player. I think you're looking at different things. You're looking at more center depth, especially someone who can play a lot early on. I think you're looking at, you would like to add more experience and size at small forward in particular, if you can. I think they would like to carry another ball handler on the main roster, unlike last season, where they basically had 2 point guards. And they have limited ways to hit those things. but they do have ways. And so I think it'll depend on like what the market allows them to do. But I think they'll be looking in all three of those directions.
I also wonder if the Edey injury is going to impact the way that Isolo coaches the team, because he does strike me as somebody that's willing to try different things,
Right.
and change his mind. And if you can't replicate what Edey brings, and like no one thinks that they can, because that's obviously a big challenge, then is he going to try to play a different way? Is he going to go back to playing sort of the way that they did to begin last season, or not fully that way, but something closer to that, and wait and adjust as the season goes on? Or is he going to lean into we need to have an identity? Whoever we've got, we're playing this way no matter what. We want to be our best in this style when the season comes to a close next year. He strikes me as somebody that might change it up as the season goes along.
Well, he was very clear to like use the word pragmatic a lot. He was very clear, I'm a pragmatist. I want to do whatever gets us the best outcomes, right? So that's one thing. On the other hand, he did have a definitive style, at least offensively, in Europe, and so there is some tension between those two things. If you have a style you like, but you say you're a pragmatist and your personnel doesn't match that style, then that brings us to this question we're asking, right? I do think the personnel fits the style in a lot of ways when you have, John Morant and Scottie Pippen both on your team. But Edey was the only big who really played that way. And so, whether they go away from that in a hard way or try to bring in another big who can play a little bit more that way, it could be either or. It could be a little bit of both. I do think they can find, whether it's with the full 8.8 or even down to lower, and I have a piece that'll be out, probably will be out by the time before the spot is, about like center candidates like you could potentially go after, right? And so if you want to spend the full 8.8 or something like that, I'm skeptical you actually get these guys, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. Like Clint Capella from Atlanta is an unrestricted free agent. Would he sign a deal at 8.8 million? Maybe. Like that's a guy who can kind of play that way, who's a rebounder, finisher at the rim, like, play in the middle. Brooke Lopez is more of a pick and pop, but he is a pick. He's a free agent this year. And there are guys lower level, who could be a little bit more physical, even down to the minimum. A guy like Kevon Looney of Golden State. A sleeper I like is a guy, Jericho Sims, who's bounced around. But when you dig into sort of some of his markers of like where he's good, it's all this kind of stuff. It's screening and offensive rebounding and like, catching lobs and that kind of thing. So I think, whether it's with a bigger free agent signing or a smaller free agent signing or some kind of trade, I think they can bring in someone who can give them more of a physical presence, who can be part of the mix. And I think they'll try to do that.
This is a little bit outside of the box here, but we'll talk draft next week. Do you think there's any chance that they just say one of those three things that you're talking about? I think more likely a center with size or a third point guard. They'll look at the draft and say, well, we're going to add a two-way player that does that so that we just have that as the break in case of emergency, if somebody else were to get hurt. Are those positionally players you think that you should keep an eye on draft?
Yeah, I think I don't think you can depend on guys that late to help you, but I think a lot of times big men have a quicker path to like getting minutes and than some other player
You can't
types.
coach size. You can't, you can't replicate that.
There are a lot of true centers that are projected in the mid to late second round to undrafted range of this draft who are 22, 23, 24 years old and have been productive at the college level. Do the Grizzlies like any of these guys? I got no idea. Do they like Amari Williams at Kentucky? Do they like the guy who was at Florida Atlantic and transferred, who's the Eastern European guy, Vladislav, I think at Michigan, right? Golden or whatever.
Yeah, Vlad Golden, yeah.
Yeah.
Do they like Dylan Cardwell, Auburn,
right.
Dylan Cardwell, 6'11"? And then
so there are a handful of guys like that, right? And if there's one of those guys at 48 or 56 or even undrafted that you think, maybe there's something there, I think it would be a great idea to have a guy like that, put him on the two-way and just see what happens. It probably won't hit, but it might. You could get a guy like that and you get him in training camp and summer league. You look up, you're like, you know what? This guy can play 10 minutes a night in the NBA. That's very possible.
I'm just thinking like somebody physical like Trey Jamison was. Like,
Yeah.
now I'm not saying, just in case of emergency, go use your avenues, try to find ways to fill the gaps on the roster, fill positionally, what you mentioned on the wing, another ball handler, a big center. But then, have some options there on the back end of things, just in case something else were to go wrong. I think that the E injury does potentially make that more likely because if you're talking about win now and talking about need, like we had discussed, would the Grizzlies even use these picks on players that they are they going to be on the main roster? I don't know. Are they just going to be two-way players potentially? Are they going to be draft and stash guys potentially for sure? But if you're trying to find an avenue in which you're going to use a draft pick and it actually makes sense and may end up helping you, I think that's probably the fastest and easiest avenue to imagine is just
Like
drafting a guy that fills those needs, but it may not be your first option.
last year's draft, 2024 draft, a year ago, pick number 52, a senior out of Boston College, Quentin Post. Guess who was in the playoff rotation for the Golden State Warriors? Quentin Post.
Yeah.
No, so I think getting a player like that and putting them on a two-way and seeing if they hit, I think makes a ton of sense for the Grizzlies. Yes.
Anything else on Edey before we move on?
I think we sort of cover the ground there.
You've also been writing about avenues to add players with the potential for a Jaren extension. There continues to be a lot of questions about this. I'm just going to offer you the floor, Chris, to explain once again. I know you've done it one time, but I feel like the people want to hear it. Why the Grizzlies might be limited in what they can do this offseason.
Well, they're going to be limited to some degree no matter which path you take, but the different paths offer different limitations. And so if the Grizzlies, and again, we've talked about this, I've written about it, I encourage people to read because you can go back. It's easier to go back and scan your eyes over a sentence a second time to try to understand it better. If the Grizzlies do the quote unquote renegotiate and extend with Jaren Jackson, they will have to. They already have some cap space. They'll probably have to clear more. But you have to be under the cap to do that, to give him the raise. And when you go under the cap to start your offseason, you lose there are certain things that you can't access once you're under the cap. That's a byproduct of using the cap space. And so they will have a smaller free agency exception if they go under the cap than if they go above the cap. They will lose access to their trade exceptions, and there's other stuff you lose access to. And so what it basically comes down to is if you go under the cap to re-sign to give Jaren Jackson a raise so you can extend him, once you give him that raise and it takes you to the cap line, at that point, and even the reason I sort of stumble on some of this is because there's always caveats. I don't want to do like every single caveat. It's hard to make definitive statements. Generally speaking, once you're at the cap line, you'll have your $8.8 million room exception and you'll have minimum contracts. That's all you can do in free agency. Now, there are exceptions to that because that includes Santi Aldama as on a cap hold as restricted free agent. You could actually just renounce your rights to Santi and have $11 million in cap space to use. Like there are other things that could happen, but you can't. The main point here is that you can't just go out and spend money under the tax line. You can spend money under the cap line. That's free money to spend. But the money between the cap line, salary cap line, and electric tax line always comes with restrictions. Those restrictions are different depending on your team situation. But the Grizzlies, once they re-sign Jaren or give Jaren a raise in order to re-sign him, will likely have $30 million in space under the luxury tax. They can't just go out and spend $30 million. They're subject to restrictions, and there would be a lot of restrictions at that point.
What's the best avenue for upgrading the roster? Is it free agency? Is it trade? Like, what do you think if they were to be, obviously
You mean based on the assumption that they do a renegotiate and extend with Jaron?
based on the assumption? Yes.
Okay. Well, at that point, anything that's not minor tweaks is going to require trades, or going to require, not
There,
bringing back Santi,
I,
which
I
is
guess I'm bringing
which is
this up
another
because
subtraction.
I've looked around myself too, and it's just like I don't know who they're going to sign for $8 million, with the exception, with the room exception. It's just I just don't know. And then there's other avenues too. It just gets so complex where you sign somebody and then you could end up trading that contract later on. But I have such a hard time, and you're so good at it that just give you your flowers to explain why this is so complicated to people, and I have a hard time understanding it myself at times. But I'm just
Well,
trying to I set up to give people a heads up of like, hey, this is if the Grizzlies are going to upgrade the roster, this is the type of thing that you can expect. But it feels like this year there's so many restrictions and there's so many doors opening and closing depending on what could happen that it's as hard as it has ever been to figure out exactly what this team's options are this summer.
yeah, no, it's especially complicated this summer because a lot of times you can start and say, okay, here's the landscape and here's what they can do. Well, the landscape is going to shift dramatically based on what does or doesn't happen with Jaron. And so that's sort of what I wrote about this week. That's sort of, you have this three forked road before you, when you take your first step, like you can step one of three directions. And depending on which direction you step, things change radically. So that's why it's hard to generalize about what they may or may not do, because it's all dependent on that. We've been operating under the assumption that they do the renegotiated extend with Sharon. And if that happens, it simplifies a little bit because that's one path. And that's the point at which you have the one free agency exception and you can do minimums. But you still have the Santi Aldama restricted free agency, and there are different paths that could go that changes things. And then you still have the prospect of other trades that could happen, right? Now you're very limited there. At that point, you got your three big guys, Ja, Jaren, Dez, and on this path we're talking about, we're not trading Jaren because you're starting with the idea of you're extending him. And you have, Brandon Clark at 12.5. And so yeah, there's a lot there. That's why I'm trying to take it piece by piece. And so the thing I wrote about today as we speak, it's about centers and big men they could target for 8.8 million or less. That's one piece to the puzzle that I wrote about, and I'll write about a different piece in a couple days.
You know, um, we also talk about, if they're making significant upgrades to the roster, trade most likely avenue. But they don't have a ton of tradable contracts, do they?
Well, I mean, again, you're operating on the assumption if we're doing the raise with Jaron that you're having to move the contract, right? Otherwise, that's a tradable contract
Yeah.
at 6.2. But if you're taking that off the board, you have a situation where you have three big contracts and lots of little contracts and one medium sized one left. And the medium sized one is Brandon Clark. And so to have trade flexibility, it's kind of good to have multiple medium sized contracts. And and so that is an issue. I mean, one path could be, and I'm reluctant to talk too much about this, but I do plan to write about it next week before I write. Like, if you wanted to move Desmond Bain, that opens up all kinds of potential possibilities. I'm not advocating for that, but that is a $36 million contract you can either use to take on a bigger contract or use to break up and take on multiple contracts, right? That would be a way to do something significant that would shake up your team. Maybe not for the better, right? And that's kind of an issue. The Brandon Clark contract at 12.5 million, you could trade that for someone making close to 20. But I think Brandon Clark, you've already lost Zach Edey to start the season, so you lose another big man. And then I think Clark's injury history makes him someone who probably has negative trade value on his own. And so if you're using that strictly as a salary match, you're having to add more value to that to get something you want from it. So I don't think that's a great contract to be trying to trade.
Have you thought about yet what a good offseason would look like? Like, what if they're able to add XYZ, that would be a great offseason for the Grizzlies. Have you thought about that? Or is it
Um,
too hard to predict where you can't even piece it
it's
together?
it's pretty hard. I've thought about some bigger scenarios, and I've wondered like, would that be good or not? I'm trying to tease that through. I think, I mean, the most likely good off season is something that people are not excited about, but that brings back good dividends, right? It's that you make small signings, with the 8.5, 8.8, and with the minimums, and maybe like a smaller trade you can work out, and you get more return than you expect on those. Like, and you add that to John Morant, Desmond Bain, Jared Jackson, Scottie Pippen, Jalen Wells, Santi Aldama, Brandon Clark. By the way, like they still got lots of good players. Zach Edey coming back. And if you hit on some stuff that, like, did Malik Beasley win Sixth Man of the Year last year? Maybe he did, or maybe he finished second to Peyton Pritchard. He was on a
Yeah.
1 year. He was on a 1 year, $6 million deal, but he's second for Sixth Man of the Year, right? They haven't done a lot of that in the Zach Kleiman era, like signing cheap veteran free agents to fill roles. This is probably a summer where they need to do that.
They've been
And if,
signing a lot of rookies.
no, they have. They've done a good job, finding guys in the second round, finding guys in the G League like Pippen and Huff. They have really not done we're going to sign this veteran player for 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, and see if he can give us 10 million in value, right? They have not done that. That is something that they probably need to pull off this summer.
That's also sort of why I like the idea of using the draft picks on a two-way player, like someone we mentioned, like Dylan Cardwell, for example, and then like that player all of a sudden, by the way, because Edey won't play in summer league, is going to have a huge role in summer league, and like maybe they pop, maybe they look good, maybe you can add a really cheap player, but you don't want to get younger, and they've been clear about that. They don't want to get younger. They don't want to get younger. But I'm just talking about making it through next season.
I think the draft two-way, because their picks are so late, I think the draft two-way stuff is really secondary to all the other team building stuff that's happening.
Yeah,
It's
it
almost
is.
it's a second track, and you're going to do what you do on that track, and if it pays dividends, great. But it's not really part of your plan.
It's just that it's first and the draft is fun. People like talking about the draft. And it's a kind of a bummer when they don't have anything to of note, you know. No top 10 pick this year, no first round pick this year. Um but that's been their best avenue, right? Like that's been their strongest avenue for improving the team. They don't have a great track record on these trades, you know.
Their track record
So
on veteran trades has been very mixed, and it's been pretty bad on higher end trades. Like there have been smaller trades, like Anthony Mountain was a trade,
yeah.
and that worked out really well. There's been some of that, but for
Steven
the
Adams turned out to be a good trade.
yeah, that was a really complicated trade with lots of facets to it. That aspect of it worked. They have not been great on the adding veterans via trade, and they haven't really tried in free agency to the point where, like, I was Tyus Jones a Kleiman signing. I think maybe he was. Maybe that's the only one that's been like a guy who's actually already done something for another NBA team of note, and you sign him as a veteran free agent. They just haven't tried to do it, but I think this is the year where they're going to have to.
Well, it's also interesting too, just relative to the teams in the finals. Like they have very successful trades, you know? Like the Pacers have a long track record. Like Naismith was a great trade. The Thunder, have a good trade history, obviously. So it's important to come through with good players in some of these scenarios. And it feels like this is an important time for the Grizzlies to add veteran pieces and find ones that work. So, that's eventually what puts a lot of these teams over the top in the postseason. So we'll see what happens this offseason. Let's talk a little bit about the rest of the league. Speaking of trades, Chris, there's a report, I think it was from Windy. There have been no trade discussions with Giannis Antetokounmpo. Does that surprise you at all?
Well, I mean, first, we're still at the standpoint where there's not really supposed to be a lot of that going on. I know there is, but
But
I
there's
mean,
supposed to be a conversation between Giannis and the Bucks.
well, that's
And
different.
maybe it's happened, but I don't know.
No, I mean yes, but that's that's separate from trade discussions. Trade discussions are outward to other teams, right? Um, it, I think the most likely scenario is that Giannis is not traded. I think it's easier to not trade someone than to trade someone. Um, I, I have a friend in Milwaukee, and I've talked to him, and he says like all of the word there is that people close to Giannis like want to stay, like they're really tied to the city. Um, there have been rumors about Giannis to get traded for 5-6 years, and like it hasn't happened. So I think it can go either way, but it's not going to surprise me if Giannis and the Bucks like talk to each other and decide like let's stick this out and let's move forward together. I don't think that'd be the least bit surprising.
You said it's not the time, but if they're going to make the trade and it's going to bring back a draft pick, wouldn't this be the time to start talking about
Well,
that
I mean,
type
what
of
I
stuff?
mean is that it there's sort of what really happens and what's supposed to happen kind of thing. Trades don't happen really until the week of the draft, and it gets complicated. Like there's still basketball going on. Like people like to talk about trades in the media right now, but now it's not the time where people get traded. And so like and I think a lot of times stuff comes together a little bit faster than maybe we think. But they're not going to be outside trade discussions in any serious way if they're just not going to trade him. And it may be that they just decide between Giannis and the Bucks that this is not going to happen.
Where do you think the landing spot should be if they're going to do that? Would you take a pick? Would you send him to Miami? Like where should it be?
Where should it be? I mean,
Yeah, where should it be?
from whose perspective, right?
Who from Milwaukee's perspective, who's got the assets you're most interested in?
Well, if it was an open like everyone make your bids, we're taking the best offer for Giannis. I think the teams that have always made the most sense from that standpoint have been Oklahoma City, Houston, and San Antonio. Those are the teams best positioned to make a deal for Giannis. I don't think Oklahoma City is, at this point was going to try to do that. Um, San Antonio, I've always had my doubts. Houston, maybe would be the most likely of the three. But to me, so that's the first layer of the teams that just from a distance like make the most sense. I've always thought there were a few teams in the East that I saw as like real sleepers if they wanted to get involved. And to me, Toronto, I wrote about this. I'm trying to remember. I think Toronto, Detroit, Orlando, those are teams that jump out to me that like, everyone's going to focus on these Western Conference teams or the big market like New York, Miami kind of stuff. But those are the ones that to me would not be huge surprises. And Toronto is the one of those that's actually been talked about publicly.
I remember when the Grizzlies fired Taylor Jenkins, there was this conversation around surprise, right? Oh, everyone nationally was so surprised, and I think people locally were less surprised. Um, with that said, were you surprised that Tom Thibodeau was let go by the Knicks? Because I certainly thought that the Knicks had, at the very least, established a team identity and had bought into it and played that way and got themselves to the Eastern Conference Finals playing that way and beat the Boston Celtics on the way there. Granted, injury to Jason Tatum. I, that to me just felt like there had to have been some level of, for lack of a better word, discomfort between the players and the coaching staff for something like that to happen.
Well, I wouldn't call it a surprise because it was talked about ahead of time as a possibility. Like it was pretty widely talked about. People were asking that question all through the late in the season and even into the playoffs. Like, would this happen? Like even like the day before it happened, there were podcasts talking about whether or not it would happen. And so, given that it was such a conversation topic, it wasn't really a surprise. Now, it seems odd given how far they went, right? But this is a guy who was the coach for several years, sort of like Taylor Jenkins, 4 or 5 years. He's a guy who has sort of a reputation for wearing out his welcome a little bit. And, they did make it to the conference finals, but they lost just the higher seed in the conference finals. I didn't have a strong feeling either way on that, but it was something that was pretty widely discussed, in the NBA media. And so it was hard for it to be that much of a surprise.
I just think if Taylor Jenkins remained the coach of the Grizzlies, and let's say they didn't finish as the 8th seed and they finished towards the top of the league and made the Western Conference Finals, there was no way. I just didn't think he would get fired in that scenario. Like these are not the same thing. I don't view them as the same. That makes sense.
No, I agree. I mean, the Taylor Jenkins, every situation is specific to itself, and I think that's probably true of Taylor Jenkins. But it's not just because like this is Memphis and that's New York or whatever. Lionel Hollins made it to the conference finals and was let go,
Yeah.
by the Memphis
Yeah.
Grizzlies, right? Like this happens. Like this is not that rare. As much as I think some quarters of the media likes to overreact and be like, "Oh my God, can you believe this?" Like, yeah, I can believe it because it happens all the time. Go check Vinny Del Negro. He made it to the conference finals and got fired by the Clippers. I mean, this is not unusual.
Do you have any thoughts on who the the Knicks should hire?
It's interesting that all the stuff that's come out publicly has been them trying to talk to coaches under contract, Ime Udoka, Chris
Yes.
Finch, and Jason Kidd. It seems like they must not want to hire Mike Malone because he's sitting right there.
I don't view Mike Malone is too similar to Tibbs.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
There's been some like completely unsourced media speculation about Taylor Jenkins just because he's also just sitting right there.
I don't see it.
I don't see it either. I'd be surprised by that. And maybe this is me being cliche about like New York or about James Dolan, the owner of New York or whatever. But I just feel like there's more of a name brand kind of guy who's likely to get that job. Like I don't think they're going to go out and hire like the assistant no one's heard of, like Phoenix just did. So I don't know. I don't know where it'll end up. There's been some speculation about the Van Gundy's there, but I don't know.
Yeah. And then they have an internal candidate as well. His name's escaping me right now.
You're talking about Johnny Bryant? He's been talked
Yeah.
about, but yeah, I'd be a little surprised if they did the first time head coach.
Yeah. I mean, it would certainly continue the trend, though, around the NBA. Lots of interim guys getting the job. Well, he didn't serve as an interim, but was internal there. So be interesting to see if that trend continues. All right, you got the Pacers and the Thunder tied 1-1 going back to Indiana. They'll play tonight. So by the time you're listening to this, you may know the results of the game. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say the Thunder win this one in game 3.
I think there's going to be a split. I don't really have an opinion on game 3 versus game 4, but I think there will be a split. It'll go back 2-2. But I do think if you told me one team is going to win both games 3 and game 4, even though those games are in Indianapolis, I think the Thunder are more likely to win both than the Pacers are to win both.
I think the Thunder are going to win both.
Yeah, no,
I think the Thunder are much better than the Pacers, and I think the Thunder blew a 15-point lead in game 1. Outside of that, this has not been competitive. This has not been all that competitive in my eyes. And I just think that, and you could say, well, the Thunder have a history of this because they did that in game 1 against Denver. I'm pretty sure, and somebody would have to double check, but like I can't remember the Thunder blowing a lot of 15-point leads during the regular season. It feels a little bit like that was a little bit of an anomaly to me, and I just don't think that in the end this is going to be all that competitive. I think the Thunder are going to win the next 3.
Yeah, my pick before the series was Thunder in 5. Your classic gentleman sweep, and my revamp prediction is that flukish comeback win in game 1 will be the exception, and otherwise it will hold the form. And so I think it'll go 6 with them getting the one win in Indiana and then having the one fluke win. But it wouldn't surprise me if the Thunder won both.
So we will see what happens there. I think that's it for us this week, but we did write. We did a lot of writing. I did a feature story on Desmond Bain and Jaren Jackson boxing in the off season. I thought it was pretty interesting talking about how that sort of how they use boxing to prepare themselves for the NBA regular season. So you can go check that out. Chris, you've done all kinds of different stuff, it feels like. And you said your new piece is coming out tomorrow on center options?
It'll be today as we speak, more than likely on center options. But yeah, so I've had a couple Grizzlies pieces this week. I did the sort of starting point, choose your own adventure of the 3 Jaron paths and what that means. And then I did a thing on lower cost centers on the free agent market they could maybe look at. And I've had a couple arts pieces this week too, but maybe I'm due for a breather now.
Yeah, well, personally, I got a lot going on, so I appreciate you carrying the load here recently, Chris. You're just an off-season machine, my friend.
Yeah.
I will have a newsletter out tomorrow as well, TBD on what it's going to be about, but I think it may get into a few draft guys because I've been starting that homework this week, and we'll see where it goes from there. All right, well, that's going to do it for us this week. For Drew and for Chris, we're out of here.